On Mother's Day, Margaret Whitmore watched her daughter slide a $20,000 diamond ring across the table to another woman while she unwrapped a $5 piece of plastic and smiled as if it meant the same. The private dining room at the Harborview Grill overlooked the Long Island Sound, sunlight bouncing off the water in soft silver waves, linen napkins folded into careful triangles, crystal glasses catching the late morning light. Everything arranged the way celebrations are supposed to be when family gathers to honor mothers. Emily had chosen the restaurant, of course. Emily always chose places that required reservations weeks in advance and valet parking that cost more than Margaret once spent on an entire week of groceries when she was raising her daughter alone after Thomas passed. Margaret sat at the round table, her navy blazer pressed, her silver hair neatly pinned at the nape of her neck, hands folded calmly in her lap, as servers poured mimosas and Daniel adjusted his cufflinks. Patricia Carter arrived last, wearing a silk scarf and pale blush and a satisfied smile that suggested she already knew she was the guest of honor. "Before we order," Emily said brightly, standing from her chair with a small velvet box in her hand, "I want to celebrate the most supportive mother I could ever ask for." The room stilled, forks hovering midair, Daniel grinning with rehearsed pride. Emily walked around the table and stopped beside Patricia, not Margaret, and when she opened the box, the diamond caught the light in a sharp, deliberate flash. $20,000, Daniel announced casually, as if discussing the weather. "And that's not all," Emily added, her voice lifting with excitement. "We booked you a 7-day Mediterranean cruise this summer. Business class flights. You deserve it." Applause followed, polite and enthusiastic, the kind that fills space more than it fills hearts. Margaret joined in, her palms meeting softly, once, twice, before resting again in her lap. When Emily finally turned toward her, the energy had shifted, less ceremony, more obligation. "And for you, Mom," she said, handing over a small gift bag from a local pharmacy, tissue paper crinkling lightly. Inside was a thin plastic bracelet with a charm shaped like a daisy, the price sticker still faintly visible near the clasp. "It made me think of you," Emily said quickly. Margaret lifted it carefully, as if it were fragile, crystal instead of molded resin, and fastened it around her wrist. "It's lovely," she replied, her tone steady, her smile practiced from years of smoothing over awkward silences at PTA meetings and holiday dinners. From across the table, Patricia admired the ring sparkling against her manicured hand, already describing which outfits she would pack for Santorini. Margaret listened, nodding at the right moments, tasting none of the lemon aioli on her plate, hearing none of the compliments about how thoughtful Emily had been. She noticed instead the way her daughter avoided her eyes, the way Daniel reached for Patricia's champagne flute first when refills came around, the way the waiter placed the check discreetly near Daniel's elbow, as though Margaret were simply another guest. The bracelet felt light against her skin, almost weightless, and yet it seemed to press down with the gravity of something far heavier than plastic. Margaret Whitmore had spent 42 years putting her daughter first. On this Mother's Day, she understood, with quiet clarity, that she was no longer first in anything at all. Margaret drove home from the restaurant with both hands steady on the steering wheel, the plastic bracelet resting against her pulse as if it were keeping time with thoughts she had carefully avoided for months. Her house in Westport sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac lined with maple trees, just beginning to turn green for the season, the same house where Emily had learned to ride a bicycle on the cracked sidewalk, and where science fair posters had once covered the dining room table for weeks at a time. The garage door lifted slowly, the familiar hum echoing in the stillness, and Margaret paused inside the car for a moment longer than usual before stepping out, as if crossing the threshold required more strength than it once had. Inside, everything was orderly, the air faintly scented with lavender from the diffuser she kept near the entryway, framed photographs lining the hallway in chronological proof of devotion. Emily in pigtails missing her front teeth, Emily in a white graduation gown under the hot June sun, Emily on her wedding day holding a bouquet Margaret had helped arrange the night before. Margaret set her handbag on the kitchen counter and removed the bracelet, placing it carefully beside the sink as though it were something delicate instead of disposable. She remembered the years when money had been tight after Thomas passed from a sudden heart condition at 59, the mortgage payment due every first of the month, the stack of utility bills that never seemed to shrink, the way she had taken on tutoring after school to make sure Emily could attend summer camp like the other children. There had been no cruises then, no diamond rings, only careful budgeting and handwritten checks slid into envelopes with hope attached. Margaret had co-signed Emily's first apartment lease, had wired $10,000 to help with a down payment when the housing market was rising faster than anyone expected, had contributed quietly to a college fund for her grandchildren even before they were born. She never kept score, because mothers are not supposed to keep score, and because love, as she had always believed, was measured in presents rather than price tags. Yet as she stood in her kitchen, sunlight stretching across the hardwood floors, she could not ignore the arithmetic forming in her mind. $20,000 for gratitude, $5 for obligation. The numbers did not hurt as much as the implication behind them. She walked into the living room and sat in Thomas's old armchair, the leather softened by decades of use, and allowed herself to replay the lunch in careful detail, the applause, the sparkle, the way Emily's laughter had risen easily when Patricia described shopping in Rome. Margaret wondered when the shift had begun, when she had moved from being central to being peripheral, from being consulted to being informed after decisions were made. She had told herself that this was the natural order of things, that children grow and build their own loyalties, that marriages rearrange priorities. But loyalty, she now realized, should not erase history. As the house settled around her in late afternoon quiet, Margaret felt something unfamiliar, yet unmistakable take shape beneath her composure. It was not anger. It was clarity. The following morning Margaret rose at 6:30 as she had done for decades, even though there was no classroom waiting and no school bell to answer to, and she moved through her routine with deliberate calm, brewing coffee in the same porcelain pot she and Thomas had received as a wedding gift, opening the kitchen blinds to let in the pale Connecticut light, and glancing briefly at the bracelet still resting near the sink where she had left it the night before. She did not put it back on. Instead, she carried her mug into the small home office off the hallway, the room where she kept neatly labeled folders for taxes, insurance policies, and the college fund statements she updated every January without fail. The computer screen glowed softly as she logged into her bank account, not with suspicion at first, but with habit, the way one checks the weather before stepping outside. Numbers lined up in tidy columns, deposits from her teacher retirement fund, modest interest from savings, automatic transfers she had set up years ago. One transfer in particular caught her attention, a monthly contribution of $2,000 to an account titled Carter Family Development, a name Emily had chosen when Daniel launched his consulting firm 3 years earlier. Margaret had agreed to help in the beginning, telling herself that temporary support was what families did when ambition needed a push. She scrolled further back through the history and saw the pattern clearly now. Wire transfers of $10,000 here, $15,000 there, always accompanied by a brief message from Emily that read, "Thank you, Mom, we will make you proud." Margaret leaned back in her chair and folded her hands, recalling how often she had declined invitations to travel with friends because she wanted to conserve funds, how she had postponed replacing the aging roof after a storm because she preferred to keep liquidity available in case Emily needed something urgent. She remembered the afternoon Emily had called in tears about a delayed investor meeting and how Margaret had driven 45 minutes to babysit so that her daughter could focus, telling her neighbors with quiet pride that her family depended on her wisdom. Yet over the past year the calls had grown shorter, the requests more transactional, the invitations to dinner increasingly framed around Patricia's schedule. Margaret opened another folder, this one containing copies of a loan agreement she had never formalized but had drafted in good faith, outlining repayment terms that were never discussed again. She realized she had never been asked whether continuing the transfers still suited her budget, whether she desired different priorities for her own retirement. Outside the window, a delivery truck slowed along the curb, and Margaret watched as it stopped in front of her house before. Moving on, a small, almost symbolic pause. She understood then that she had mistaken access for appreciation, that her role had shifted quietly from mother to resource, from honored parent to silent partner. The clarity she felt the evening before sharpened into resolve, not loud or dramatic, but steady and precise, like the click of a lock turning into place. 2 days later, Margaret found herself seated in the waiting area of her local credit union, a modest brick building just 10 minutes from her home, the kind of place where the tellers still greeted her by name and asked about her garden in early spring. She had not scheduled an appointment in advance, yet when the receptionist recognized her, she was ushered into a small office with frosted glass walls and a desk neatly arranged with brochures about retirement planning and long-term saving strategies. Margaret folded her hands in her lap as she waited, her posture straight, her expression composed, the same demeanor she had carried into parent-teacher conferences for nearly 30 years. When the financial advisor entered, he smiled warmly and asked how he could assist her, and Margaret answered with a calm that surprised even herself. She explained that she wished to review all recurring transfers connected to the Carter Family Development account and to discuss options for restructuring her estate planning documents. She spoke without accusation, without emotion, simply outlining figures and dates, amounts and frequencies, the facts laid out as clearly as lesson notes once written in careful cursive across a chalkboard. As the advisor pulled up her records, Margaret watched the numbers populate the screen, a silent ledger of generosity that had extended far beyond what most parents would consider temporary help. There were quarterly transfers labeled investment bridge, emergency liquidity, and operational cushion, each one initiated at Emily's request and fulfilled without hesitation. The advisor cleared his throat gently and asked whether she wished to continue these contributions indefinitely. Margaret paused for a measured breath before answering that she would prefer to suspend them until further notice. The words felt neither harsh nor vengeful. They felt appropriate. She then inquired about revising beneficiary designations on several accounts, including the education fund she had established for her grandchildren. She did not remove their names, but she adjusted the structure so that distributions would be controlled through a trust rather than direct parental access. It was a subtle change, but a significant one. As documents were printed and placed before her, Margaret read each line carefully, her eyes steady, her signature firm and deliberate. She was not erasing her love, she was redefining its boundaries. When she stepped back into the afternoon sunlight, a light breeze moved through the parking lot, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass. Margaret felt no surge of triumph, no dramatic sense of revenge. What she felt instead was alignment, as though an imbalance that had tilted quietly for years had finally been corrected by a small but decisive shift. In the days that followed, she did not call Emily to announce the changes. She did not send a pointed message or reference the lunch at the harbor. She returned to her routines, tended to her roses, attended her book club, and allowed the new silence to speak for itself. For the first time in a long while, Margaret understood that generosity without respect was not virtue. It was vulnerability. And she had just closed the door on being vulnerable in that way again. A week passed before the shift became visible on the other side. Margaret was trimming the hedges along her front walkway when her phone vibrated in the pocket of her cardigan, the screen lighting up with Emily's name, and she let it ring twice before answering, not out of strategy, but out of steadiness. Emily's voice sounded hurried, threaded with a tension that had not been present during their recent celebratory lunch. She asked whether Margaret had changed anything related to the monthly transfers because Daniel had noticed that the expected deposit had not appeared in their business account. Margaret rested one hand on the handle of the pruning shears and replied evenly that she had reviewed her finances and decided to pause additional contributions for the time being. There was a brief silence, the kind that reveals more than raised voices ever could. Emily responded with confusion first, then a careful attempt at persuasion, explaining that the company was in a growth phase, that timing was critical, that family support made all the difference in competitive markets. Margaret listened without interrupting, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across her lawn, and when Emily finished, she said that she believed in their capability but also believed in financial balance. She did not mention the ring or the cruise or the bracelet. She did not mention the seating arrangement at Christmas or the forgotten candles on her birthday cake. She spoke only of prudence and sustainability. Emily's tone shifted slightly, less confident now, asking whether something was wrong, whether she had done something to upset her. Margaret considered the question carefully and answered that nothing was wrong, only that she had realized it was time to reorganize her priorities for this chapter of her life. She explained that she had updated certain estate documents to ensure that future support for the grandchildren would be structured responsibly, and that this change was about clarity, not punishment. On the other end of the line, Emily exhaled audibly, as though recalibrating expectations in real time. She reminded Margaret that Patricia had always said parents should invest in their children's success, a statement delivered with casual authority. Margaret replied gently that investment without accountability was not wisdom. The conversation ended without resolution, polite but strained, and as Margaret slipped her phone back into her pocket, she noticed that her hands were steady. She resumed trimming the hedges, shaping each line with patient precision, understanding that boundaries, like gardens, require maintenance if they are to remain healthy. That evening, as she prepared a simple dinner of grilled salmon and steamed asparagus for herself, she felt a quiet sense of equilibrium settle into place. The world had not shifted dramatically, no dramatic confrontation had occurred, yet something fundamental had realigned. Margaret no longer waited to be valued. She had begun to value herself first. By the end of the month, the distance between Margaret and her daughter had settled into something measurable, not in miles but in tone, in timing, in the careful selection of words that once flowed freely without calculation. Emily still called, but the conversations were shorter and more structured, updates about the children's soccer schedule, brief mentions of business developments, polite inquiries about Margaret's health that felt more procedural than personal. Margaret responded with warmth yet restraint, offering encouragement without offering solutions, listening without volunteering financial reassurance. She noticed how often Emily referenced Patricia's advice, how frequently phrases like "we talked it over with Patricia" replaced what used to be "I wanted to ask you." The shift no longer stung, it informed her. One afternoon, Margaret received a group message announcing that the Mediterranean cruise had been upgraded to a suite with a private balcony, accompanied by photographs of Patricia smiling against a backdrop of blue water and white stone buildings. Margaret tapped the screen once to enlarge the image, studying her contemporary's expression not with envy, but with observation. She wondered whether Patricia understood the full cost of the generosity extended toward her, not only in dollars, but in displaced loyalty. Margaret set the phone aside and returned to her dining table, where brochures from a travel agency lay neatly arranged. 2 days earlier, she had walked into a small office downtown and inquired about a fall trip to Vermont during peak foliage season, something she had postponed year after year while prioritizing other expenses. The travel consultant had described scenic train routes, historic inns, and guided tours through maple forests glowing in shades of amber and crimson. Margaret had listened with a quiet excitement she had not felt in some time. She booked the trip that afternoon, selecting a comfortable but modest package, paying in full without hesitation. It was not extravagance, it was intention. That evening, as she updated her calendar, she realized that her schedule no longer revolved around anticipated requests. She enrolled in a continuing education course at the local community center, a seminar on creative writing that met every Thursday at 6:30, reclaiming a part of herself that had once thrived on storytelling and reflection. When Emily called later that week to mention a potential shortfall in the company's quarterly projections, Margaret listened kindly and suggested consulting a financial advisor, the same one she had visited herself. There was a pause, then a subdued acknowledgement. Margaret did not feel victorious. She felt aligned. The balance she had restored within her accounts was now reflected in her days. She was no longer reacting to absence or chasing recognition. She was building a life that did not depend on it. And for the first time since that lunch by the water, she understood that stepping back had not diminished her role, it had clarified it. Autumn arrived quietly in Westport, the air turning crisp in the early mornings, the maples along Margaret Street beginning to glow with hints of gold and rust, and with the season came a subtle shift in the rhythm of her family's communication. Emily's calls grew more frequent again, but the tone had changed from casual updates to cautious inquiries, questions framed carefully as though testing unfamiliar ground. One evening, Emily asked whether Margaret would be available to watch the children for a long weekend, because Patricia and Daniel were considering joining a business networking retreat out of state. Margaret listened while stirring a pot of vegetable soup on her stove, the scent of thyme rising gently into the kitchen, and she answered that she had already made travel plans for that weekend. There was a pause on the line, followed by surprise. Margaret explained that she would be in Vermont, taking a scenic train tour through the mountains during peak foliage season, something she had wanted to do for years. Emily hesitated before responding that she did not realize her mother was traveling alone. Margaret replied that she was looking forward to it. The conversation ended politely, but the balance had shifted again. A few days later, Emily drove over unannounced, her car pulling into the driveway just after 4 in the afternoon. Margaret welcomed her inside with the same courtesy she always had, offering tea and a seat at the kitchen table. Emily's expression carried a mix of concern and confusion, as though she were trying to locate the version of her mother who had always been predictably accommodating. She asked directly whether Margaret was upset about anything, whether the financial pause had been a reaction to feeling overlooked. Margaret folded her hands calmly and answered that she was not upset, only aware. She explained that she had reached a stage in life where her resources, both financial and emotional, required thoughtful allocation. She reminded Emily that support was a gift, not an obligation, and that respect was not measured by dollar amounts, but by consideration. Emily listened without interrupting, her posture softening as the words settled between them. Margaret did not accuse, did not reference comparisons or specific events, yet the implication was clear. She was no longer operating from habit. She was operating from choice. Before leaving, Emily stood in the doorway for a moment longer than usual, as if recalibrating the dynamic she had once taken for granted. After the car disappeared down the street, Margaret returned to her kitchen, rinsed the teacups, and glanced at the small travel itinerary pinned to her refrigerator. The dates were circled in blue ink. For the first time in many years, her calendar reflected her desires first. The quiet that followed felt different from before. It was no longer the silence of exclusion. It was the silence of self-assurance. The train moved slowly through the Vermont countryside, its wide windows framing hills washed in amber and crimson, and Margaret sat comfortably in her seat beside the glass, hands folded over a light wool coat, watching the landscape unfold without urgency. The rhythm of the tracks beneath her felt steady and reassuring, a measured forward motion that mirrored the quiet transformation of the past months. Around her, other passengers murmured softly, couples pointing out distant barns, a child pressing his palm against the window in awe. Yet Margaret remained content in her solitude. She had chosen this journey for herself, paid for it herself, and planned it without consulting anyone's calendar but her own. When the train curved along a river edged with brilliant maple trees, she allowed herself a small smile, the kind that did not need to be witnessed to be meaningful. That afternoon she checked into a historic inn with white columns and a wide porch lined with rocking chairs, the wooden floors creaking gently underfoot as she carried her overnight bag upstairs. She unpacked carefully, placing her travel itinerary on the bedside table, and noticed how light her suitcase felt compared to the weight she had been carrying earlier in the year. Later, as she sat on the porch with a cup of hot cider, her phone buzzed with a message from Emily. The text was brief but different in tone from the ones before. It read that the children missed her and asked if she would like to have dinner together the following week, just the 3 of them. There was no mention of business projections, no reference to financial support, no comparison to anyone else. Margaret read the message twice, not searching for hidden motives, but appreciating the shift in language. She replied that she would enjoy dinner and suggested a small Italian restaurant near her home that she had always liked. A few minutes later, another message appeared, this one thanking her for always being present and expressing hope that they could spend more time together without distractions. Margaret did not interpret the words as an apology, nor did she require one. What mattered was the recalibration. Respect had begun to return, not because she demanded it loudly, but because she demonstrated that it was the condition under which she would continue to participate. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley, Margaret leaned back in her rocking chair and listened to the evening settle around her. She understood now that love did not require self-neglect, that generosity did not require self-erasure. By stepping back, she had not fractured her family. She had redefined her place within it. And in that quiet Vermont twilight, Margaret Whitmore felt something she had not felt in a long time when it came to her daughter. Not expectation, not disappointment, simply balance.